Welcome everyone to this Religion Media Centre election briefing, in which we're going to be looking at the issue of immigration, the party's manifesto pledges on it, how some religious groups are affected by and responding to it. I'm very grateful to you for joining us. Do please put comments and questions in the chat box so that I can come to you later in the conversation after we've heard from panellists. Panel, thank you so much for taking the time to contribute. I'm going to begin by coming to you all in turn to ask you to briefly introduce yourselves and tell me in just a couple of sentences why or whether the issue of immigration matters to you in the sphere of your work. And I'm going to go first to you, Krish, because you're in a park and who knows what might happen in a park and how long you'll be staying with us. Just do introduce yourself to us, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry I'm in a park. I'm in Hyde Park. I had 2 trains delayed. I should be in an office. I run a tiny little sanctuary foundation. It's a catalyst for bringing social change, particularly around refugee resettlement. And I founded it because of my faith. The Christian faith is very clear about welcoming the stranger wherever they're from. And one of the big disappointments for me is so little has been built on the incredible response we've seen from the British public towards Ukrainian refugees. That should have set a new bar in how we're able to respond to all asylum seekers and refugees around the world. And it's been a historic moment that none of the parties have really cashed in that amount of public goodwill there is towards refugees. So looking forward to talking to you later.
Just stay with us a moment, Krish. Is there one policy or commitment in one or more of the party manifestos which you particularly welcome or which particularly concerns you?
Well, they are related. I'm particularly concerned about the Rwanda scheme. I think it's an immoral scheme. I think it's unlawful, unworkable, and uneconomically viable. I think it rescinds all of the UK's responsibilities towards asylum seekers. In fact, it undercuts the global asylum process, which is a desperately terrible thing to do. It's like people deciding after dinner they were going to split the bill, but one person sods off without actually spending any money. That's what we've done. We've undercut the entire system. So obviously I'm very disappointed that the Conservative Party still have that as one of their key proponents. And I guess I'm pleased that the Labour Party have committed to ending it and really pursuing the bad guys in all of this. The villains in the whole scheme are the people that are smuggling people, trafficking people, and going hard after them does seem to be the right approach. So I'm really encouraged that has been the stance of the Labour Party.
Thank you. Zara Mohammed, you're from the Muslim Council of Britain.
Hi, Rosie. Yeah, thank you so much. I can't say it better than Krish, to be honest. Obviously a huge amount of conversation has been around immigration, legal and illegal. But prior to that, this awful Rwanda bill and the whole rhetoric around and hostility towards refugee communities in particular is deeply troubling for us. So we've actually called for the Rwanda bill to be scrapped because it's not feasible. But I think what you touched on, Krish, was so important in terms of the differential treatment towards refugees and those fleeing conflict and where they're coming from and how they're treated. And we've seen that in the political rhetoric that in some of these interviews, but also how it's a hot button issue that politicians are kind of shy from really talking about. We're going to ship people, we're going to fly people off to Rwanda, but it's going to cost millions of pounds. And of course, it sounds completely preposterous anyway, as a student of international law. But also on the other hand, we're not going to provide legal routes. We're not talking about all the people who are still in hotels. And these are all people with skills who have also dignity and respect and can actually contribute to society and want to do things.
Okay.
And then I think we've got these challenging narratives. And for Muslim communities in particular, it's often conflated with Muslims, this immigration chat. So yeah, I think there's a lot at play here.
Thank you. Sebastian Milbank, can I come to you?
So I'm the executive editor of The Critic magazine, and we look a lot at the issue of migration, both from the perspective of persecuted Christians worldwide, which is something we have a lot on, and we also cover conservative politics a great deal. So I think one concern for a lot of our contributors, and something I've written on as well, is the sort of Janus-based approach of the Conservative Party, which on the one hand, very furious rhetoric about migration, about refugees, this very myopic focus on small boats, but at the same time, unprecedented levels of legal migration. So I'm quite interested in that dichotomy.
Thank you. Liam Olmark.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I work for the Jesuit Refugee Service UK. We're part of an international Catholic organisation that serves refugees of all faiths and none in over 50 countries around the world. And here in the UK, we have a particular mission to people who are made destitute by the asylum system or held in immigration detention. In terms of why this is an important issue for this election, Pope Francis has said that refugees aren't pawns on the chessboard of humanity. They're men, they're women, they're children. And at JRS UK, we come to know the people we serve as friends. And I think at this election, as Christians and as people of faith, as some of the other speakers have said, we've got a chance to share that message with our politicians and to help shape the kind of society that we want to see. So do we want a country where refugees are treated as pawns, shipped off to Rwanda, locked in detention, denied the chance to contribute to society? Or do we want a country that recognises refugees as people equal to any other person made in the image of God, and a country that's proud to welcome people and gives them a chance to participate in our society?
Thank you. And Paul Bickley.
Thanks, Rosie. I'm Paul. I work for the religion and society think tank Theos. And we're working on a series of briefings of reports using the British Election Study, which is a major survey, multiple wave across multiple years. And we were interested in the run-up to the election to understand voting intention and some an approach to issues through the prism of religious faith. So we've published a paper on migration recently, and that's on our website if people want to see that, looking at Christian attitudes to migration.
Well, let's just stay with that now and ask you to tell us a little bit about it. I mean, obviously you make distinctions, as the British public do, between different sorts of immigration in your questioning. So let's start with asylum seekers and the levels of sympathy or not that they encounter from within different religious groups. Just summarise your findings for us there.
Well, it's worth saying that the British public as a whole are that they think immigration as a whole is a priority issue, and that's one of the reasons why we looked at this issue. And they're not overly positive about asylum seekers. So, on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is very many fewer and 10 is a lot more, the British public score about 3.8. So on average and as a whole, they are looking for a reduction in numbers. And I think that's because they see asylum seekers as the problem of immigration, or the issue of immigration as a whole. There's an insufficient separation out of legal and illegal migration. But when we look at that by religious groups, we find that even though the British public is cold overall, that some religious groups are even colder than that. So non-practising Anglicans are the coldest religious group overall. It's worth saying that, as with all these pieces of research, people will see a very strong practice effect. So if somebody is regularly practicing their faith, they're more likely to be open to higher levels of asylum seekers. But even in the Anglican group there, it's still below the national average. In other Christian groups, in the Roman Catholic group, in the other Christian other Christian traditions, they fall either side of that line. So if you have non-practicing Roman Catholics, for instance, they're more resistant to asylum seekers. Practicing Roman Catholics are more open to asylum seekers, and the most open group overall is the Muslim group.
I don't know if any of our panelists would like to sort of respond to those findings. I mean, Sebastian, I don't know what you make of them.
Well, I think the really big question here, and it's something that after I'm getting names here, but someone raised, I think, very importantly, which is the question of winning consent. So the Ukraine scheme was very successful, I think, because people understood clearly what the people involved were facing. We've had incredible coverage of the Ukraine conflict. I think it was well planned for. We knew where people were going. We knew how they would be supported. There was a clear perception that those involved were genuine refugees, and the fact that they were primarily numbered amongst women and children and vulnerable people, I think, made it a very well executed process. I think one of the reasons the small boats issue has received such disproportionate attention is because it feels uncontrolled. So I think where you can put a sense of the public is in control of the conversation on refugees, where you can put things to them. People feel that they've consented, they've agreed, it's been planned for, it's not placing an undue burden on the poorest communities. I think that's a process that can sustainably win consent for immigration, even for refugees, even on quite a large scale. But where it's uncontrolled, even at a very small level, you can create huge resistance and resentment.
Just to come off two things that were said there. One was from Paul. I mean, I personally, as a Christian, found the results really depressing. Not that the research wasn't done brilliantly, just the results were very depressing. But people who are within the kind of bounds, if you like, of the Christian faith haven't really understood the heart of it. And we've seen this with, Richard Dawkins describing himself as Team Jesus. Do you remember? He doesn't believe any of the tenets of the Christian faith. He doesn't think Jesus lived and died and rose again. But he wants to be Team Jesus because he's taking an anti-Islam approach. He'd rather have a Christian country than an Islamic country. So then it becomes a cultural war. And that's about as far away from the heart of the Christian faith as you can get. The two greatest commandments: love God, love your neighbour. And who is your neighbour? Anybody that's in need. So I want to say that. And then the second thing, Sebastian, you're right about this kind of public sympathy. There was definitely more public sympathy for Ukraine. But it's interesting, actually, the Homes for Ukraine scheme was in one sense uncontrolled. The government promised an uncapped sponsorship program. So however many sponsors came forward, that's how many people could come in. So there was no upper limit. There was no target. And we were able to mobilize thousands of people, just even churches. We had 2,000 churches from our little charity that were stepping forward, 29,000 individuals. So there is a difference in sympathy. We tried to ask the government for a similar scheme for Sudan. There's a terrible war going on in Sudan, mostly unreported. We had thousands of Sudanese families that live in the UK already that wanted to sponsor their family members to get out of the war zone. Often that was mothers and sisters that they were trying to get out of gender-based violence context. And there was just no public sympathy, no media attention really, and no government will. So I think what we had with Ukraine was government openness, media attention, which allowed there to be public sympathy. And we just never had that for Sudan. And I hope we're going to get to talk about Israel and Gaza, because that's another area of refugee crisis that the UK has done absolutely nothing to help.
Thank you, Krish. Zara, I'm going to come to you. I don't know whether you've got any reflections on what complexion of government might respond to some of those issues, or should, in your view, respond to some of those issues that Krish has just raised.
Yeah, I think there's a complete challenge here regarding paradigm narratives and that whole point, Sebastian, you're making about controlled and uncontrolled, but actually everything can be controlled if there's government will to do it. Inevitably, conflicts are now continuing to bubble up. Displacement is getting worse. Obviously, today marks World Refugee Day. So we know the tide of this is going to get worse. What's not helpful, though, is how we're conflating lots of different types of immigration help. So one side of this is around universities who are talking about, look, we need international students, but you've made it really, really difficult for them to come in. The second, as Chris pointed out, well, what about the Gazan refugees? We could control that and have them on board, but is there public sympathy to do so? And the Scottish Government actually said, why can't we do this? And then we've got things around, what we're comfortable to talk about when it comes to migration and not. And Ukraine is a kind of prime example of, it's clear and it was made clear and everybody followed it. But even with those refugees now, it's kind of where are they hanging the balance? So I think there's a lot for an incumbent government to really think about in terms of not just the narratives and how the media addresses this topic, because that plays a huge part of it. The vote winner or loser and the boats it captures the imagination of people that they feel like we're being invaded almost, people are taking over. but also the rhetoric of people like Nigel Farage, who is getting lots of column inches, lots of airtime. He said this is an immigration election, and he's talked about in a very hostile way, particularly when it comes to Muslims and particularly when it comes to immigration, how we need to lock our borders and all the rest of it. So I think there's a lot of levels to challenge. The positives is that there's lots of people willing and lots of good faith actors to help. The UK is a place of sanctuary, and faith communities play a remarkable role in providing that. But I think if we rely on, I think civil society and government partnership will be critical with faith communities to do this. And part of it is around changing language, but offering, as you said, skilled refugee work, people who want to work and contribute, let them do so.
Thank you.
Providing safe and legal ways to come into the country is critical.
Liam Olmert, you want to make a comment about Catholic thinking on this, I think?
The Catholic teaching on these issues is very clear from Pope Francis' leadership on this, and drawing on over 100 years of Catholic social teaching on welcoming refugees. But I think just picking up on the point Zara made there, it's really important that whatever these statistics are saying, not to overlook the enormous willingness and positivity within faith communities to welcoming refugees, and that actually that's something really to be celebrated. Every day in our work, we encounter people primarily from the Catholic community, but more broadly, who are opening up their homes to host for refugees, who are donating their time, their money, their efforts, walking into work. Yesterday, there were people waiting at the front door with bags of clothes and bedding to donate and support. So, and I think we really need to celebrate, and politicians, candidates of all parties need to recognise that actually in all faith communities, there's this really strong, willingness, and there's this whole body of people who do stand with refugees and do want to see a more welcoming society. And just something else to add there, again, picking up on a point Zara made about some of the media rhetoric. Something Pope Francis has talked a lot about is around the culture of encounter, and I think it's really important that we shift from talking about boats, talking about numbers, talking about different categories, to actually talking about people. And something that we see, people from whatever their faith backgrounds, when they have an opportunity to encounter refugees, get to know them, get to understand their stories, and get to see them as people, that's where attitudes really begin to shift and really begin to change.
Thanks very much. Now, on the manifestos, the Liberal Democrats are probably the warmest. They start by speaking of the UK's proud history in welcoming newcomers. I think that actually somebody's already mentioned the SNP positively welcoming immigration, although it's not a devolved issue. Plaid Cymru also says Wales needs more immigration, not less. The Greens' key message is to provide safe routes for asylum seekers and end hostile environments. But I wonder if there is, obviously the Rwanda scheme is going to be scrapped if Labour or the Liberal Democrats win power. But I wonder, Krish, whether you see very much difference between the parties apart from that. There's still obviously a very clear message from Labour about getting control back over the borders, reducing numbers of asylum seekers and so on.
Yes, at one level, both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have stated they think immigration is too high. That aligns them with the Reform Party as well. So there is a kind of mood music that the general public are worried about immigration, and I feel like both Labour and Conservative are trying to kind of go into that space. And as we've said, we haven't really differentiated between the different forms of migration, whether that's planned resettlement, whether that's having a functioning asylum system, or whether you've got a kind of skilled workers approach to this. So I want to be able to push back on the entire narrative about migration. Imagine this, I think what was one of the Reform candidates was at Heathrow Airport and said, "Oh, look, there's so many people coming here." And you go, actually, that's a good thing. Like, it's fantastic for the British economy to have lots of people come into the country through Heathrow Airport. It's great for tourism, So a lot of the migration is really good for us. It's great for our education system. We're seeing billions of pounds worth of investment coming into our education system because of international students. So I do want to challenge the wider anti-migration narrative that's out there. But when it comes to asylum, I think the Rwanda scheme is basically the single shot that the Conservatives have. It's all about deterrence. And I think they need to build on the strength that they had before. For example, with Albania. Albania, a lot of the migration is not coming because of a war or because of persecution. That is because of poverty. And so there are some really good schemes that the government have been working on a proper returns program, but also investment to help Albania develop so that young people, it's mainly young boys, have got a reason to stay in the country. We call it the anchors, not walls approach, that you build a reason to stay. And we've seen that happen in the past in the areas around Syria, particularly in Jordan. There was investment. So I think there needs to be a more joined up approach between international development and migration. And we haven't really seen that. I didn't check the Labour Party on this, but I know the Conservatives have said that they do want to see us get back up to 0.7% in terms of our international development budget. And I think that's very healthy. And for me, it's good to find something positive in the Conservative Party manifesto.
I just want to go back to Paul at Theos. You've said in the chat box, concerns about migration are generally driven by resources, services, housing, etc., rather than by cultural questions. I wonder if you can just, again, from the perspective of the research that you did with Theos, tell us what the difference between religious groups are in attitudes to immigration, which are not from asylum seeking.
So we see the same patterns, roughly speaking. So the British public as a whole is less hostile when it comes to different kinds of migration, so family reunification, to student migration, which is, of course, a big part of the relatively high levels of migration that we've seen over the last couple of years. And they are more open, in fact, than they were on EU migration and out EU migration. So those are the kind of categories that the British election study collects data on. And we see a similar pattern overall. So some religious groups, namely the Christian religious groups, are more resistant to the levels of migration that we see there. But again, there's a practice effect. So those who are more likely to be in church are more likely to be more open than average when it comes to all of those categories. Again, it seems like the Anglican category is slightly harder on each of those things. They're the exception, as it were. Otherwise, the Roman Catholics, the other Christians, sort of spread their legs over the center point. The least practicing are more hostile. The most practicing are more open. And again, the other religious communities, Muslim community, are more open overall in each of those. Not a surprise, of course, because many of those will be foreign nationals in the first instance anyway. But it is true. I did just want to kind of make this point. It's quite easy to, I understand passions are high, and in some ways, I understand the point and have sympathy with the point as well. It's quite easy to moralize on this. But from the data that we have, which is not the British election study, but other data, it seems that where people are concerned about migration, it tends to be a resource issue rather than a cultural issue, i.e., are we looking at racism? That certainly there's a degree of that, there's bound to be, but it's also about public services, it's about NHS, it's about housing. So if we're not doing so well there in any case, I think people will become more concerned about levels of migration. So it's just I suppose a caveat to some of those strong kind of felt reactions that we have when we see some figures like this that seem to imply considerable hostility, particularly to asylum seekers.
Thanks very much. Panel, do put up your hands if you'd like to come in. But I'm just going to, rather unfairly, actually, Ian, Paul, I'm going to come to you because I'm not going to ask one of the questions that you've asked yet. But thank you for joining us. You're on the Archbishop's Council. You do not speak for the bishops. No, you do not. But I have to put to you that it might appear from the findings that Paul's presenting, that actually the House of Bishops in the House of Lords is very out of step with Anglican opinion on this issue.
Yes, I think it is. And I think that's not just on this issue, but on a whole range of issues. I'm very interested by the kind of discourse we've had. I was fascinated, for example, that Krish Kandiah immediately picked up a hesitation about migration generally and immediately identified it with reform. So there seems to be, amongst certain Christian groups, a tendency to say that any concerns about migration are far right, and you associate them with Nigel Farage, so that they become illegitimate. And I think it's very interesting to watch the BBC coverage of the election, how often they now use the term right and far right. It's really fascinating broadly in Europe, where there's a concern, for example, to protect jobs from uncontrolled migration. That used to be a left-wing concern, but now it's being labelled far right. And I think that's really skewing the whole debate. I think there's a couple of things which are really important. I think Paul put his finger on an issue. We're not separating the issues of welcoming refugees from the issue of the broad issue of uncontrolled migration. I mean, we live in a country now where 1 in 6 members of our country were not born here. Now, have we built 20% more houses? No. Have we built 20% more hospitals? No. Have we opened 20% more schools? No, we haven't. How governments can have this kind of policy? I mean, I don't think there's a particularly sort of Christian faith point of view, but it's generally a question about coherence of policies.
Yeah, I may come back to you in a bit, Ian, but if Krish is there, I just want you to respond to what Ian just said.
So I think I said that both the Labour Party, the Conservative Party are aligned with reform in saying that migration is too high. So I'm not saying everybody that believes migration is too high is a reform person. I mean, it is interesting that different groups have received different levels of support. So, for example, we had 200,000 people come from Hong Kong to the UK over the last 3 years, exactly the same number as people have come from Ukraine. And the groups that are normally the most hostile to migration have said nothing about that group. So someone raised earlier whether it's a race issue or a resource issue. I think it's a mixture of a lot of those things. I think it is, not everybody that's opposed to immigration is racist, but a lot of people that are opposed to immigration are racist. I think there are some race elements. And it's not quite as simple because obviously we welcomed about 25,000 Afghans, we welcomed 200,000 people from Hong Kong. And they're people that we have some kind of affiliation to. So Hong Kong was part of the empire. It was part of the Commonwealth. Afghanistan, we had some military interests there. And Ukrainians, well, you know, we share a lot of cultural heritage. But there does seem to be a difference of approach when it comes to people coming from Muslim countries. And for me, that's part of the rhetoric I hear most often on my Twitter feed. Is people are really worried about Muslim people coming and installing an Islamic government. They're anti-Western. That's where we're chiming in with what people, the cultural Christians like Richard Dawkins are saying. So I think there is that layer there, and it's difficult to tease it out. We're not saying everybody that's on the same page, but we've got to address those different aspects.
Thank you. Zara, I'm going to bring you into that because, I mean, one of the things that Reform has in its manifesto, you know, along with taking people on boats back to France or detaining them and freezing non-essential migration, is protect British culture and values. And I just wonder whether that's, well, the term's dog whistle, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. You know, what are we talking about when we talk about British values, and why do we only use that test for certain communities over others? I mean, look, politically, scapegoating certain communities over others on topics like migration is not a new thing. It's not even just a reform thing. It's something that's been going on for the last decade or two, or even beyond that. Critically, we have got an economic crisis. There is an issue in terms of infrastructure, resourcing, and all these other things. It's one of the top things that Britons and all of our communities are concerned about. But it's how these are positioned when it comes to narrative policy and framing. And that's where the trouble really starts. And reform is just the severe end of the spectrum in terms of stoking that. And we've seen lots of videos now about why people are voting reform, immigration being one of them. And it's this whole takeover theory. I think there was one today, I've not got a job. And the interviewer asked, well, why haven't you, what are they saying when you're being interviewed? Oh, well, I've got a criminal record and then there's for assault. So you're not getting a job because all these refugees are coming in. So I think there's some really divisive narratives that are using what is, I guess, legitimate. Every country is concerned about its borders, its migration. How are we going to support all these refugees that are coming? How do we ensure their kids are getting the best education and infrastructure? But also there is this lack of appreciation of, well, yeah, I mean, myself, I'm third generation. So am I still considered in that migrant category, And I think that's where the British values test continues to come. We're never quite British enough and we're never quite contributing enough. And, the infrastructure is crumbling. 44,000 Muslims are in the NHS saving British lives every day. So we pick and choose our narratives. And I think that's the danger. Of course, everybody is legitimately concerned about resourcing, infrastructure, capacity, and integration and social cohesion. We all want people to get on, and people who come from different communities have to work that out. But we have a rich history and tradition of doing that. And that's where I think we have to do it better when certain political parties are pushing really, really divisive narratives that demonize certain communities over others.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Sebastian next.
Yes, well, I want to address this dichotomy we've got at the moment between the question of a legitimate concern over resources and an illegitimate racism, because of course we would all reject and despise racism, but we've mentioned the question of Islam, but Islam is, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you, it's not a race, it's a religion with many white adherents. I know I have several convert friends. I've got, there are, of course, Caucasian Muslims of all races and backgrounds, just as there are of Christians. And a lot of what people object to is, of course, questions of resources. And I think that's the largest issue. But there are also questions over culture, and not all of those are illegitimate. So I think, for example, the issue of female genital mutilation, that's now a problem in British schools and for British policymakers. That's never been the case before. Now, that isn't a blanket reason to reject migration, let alone refugees, but it is a legitimate cause for concern that ought to be debated in British politics. And I think one of the reasons this debate has become so toxic, so divisive, why it's driven groups like Reform, is a sense that mainstream parties are unwilling to address it in a direct, persuasive manner. And I think it's infantilizing for voters. People resent it. I don't think people who actually face racism are helped by it. In fact, it often makes things worse. And I think if you also look at issues such as,
but Sebastian, I don't think there's any equivocation about FGM, is there? I mean, it's illegal.
Well, of course, but I was going to go on to say the issue. If you look at other issues such as Rwanda, we had examples where the police were unwilling to act for the fear of perception of racism. And I think when we bring race into issues of migration, whenever we've got people who oppose it, you quickly put people in a position of having to divert their conversation to other areas. So you're not able to deal with an actual cultural problem between two groups of people trying to live together, and a minority of people creating a problem. And instead, suddenly you're having to talk in general terms about, and I think that's exactly where we start to get into trouble.
Thank you. Liam, you wanted to pick up Ian's question about the number of refugees.
Yeah, thank you. Just picking up on the question in the chat on what would be a reasonable number of refugees in the world for the UK to welcome, and I think it's really important for the framing of this to recognise that in the UK less than 1% of our population are refugees or asylum seekers. We're talking about a comparatively very small number of people, despite the picture that the political and media rhetoric might often try to paint, and that's particularly important when we're talking about issues with housing and the healthcare system. And these shouldn't be attributed to a very small number of people who are coming to seek sanctuary here. And alongside that, I think it's really important to recognise that the vast majority of refugees, we're talking upwards of 70% are seeking sanctuary in the countries neighbouring their own countries. In my previous job, I did a bit of work in Lebanon, where we're talking about near 25% of the population equivalent was made up of refugees. So some of the poorest countries in the world are playing the biggest role in welcoming people. And as all the speakers have touched on earlier, when it comes to it, the UK can and has stepped up to welcome people. After Alan Kurdi died, which was one of the last times we were really talking about refugees as people in the media and in politics, the UK stepped up with resettlement programs, community sponsorship. After the invasion of Ukraine, people opening up their houses to welcome people here. So, we are currently playing a really small role in the global picture when it comes to providing protection. We can be doing a lot more. The problem is that at the moment, we're actually looking at going completely the other way. The policies, Rwanda plan, the Illegal Migration Act are actually shutting down the opportunity for people to claim asylum here. And as Chris touched on earlier, that's really rejecting our responsibility as a global player, and it's something that we need to be doing better on.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you, Rosie. Just two comments from me. One is a little bit around the culture. I was at a global migration summit yesterday, and we had a fantastic missiologist from Malawi tell us about the church attendance statistics in London. And actually, the vast majority of people that attend church in London are migrants that have come to the UK. So there's Christian migration into the UK. There's actually revitalised and helped many churches, and that's often not talked about when we think about this. But the second thing, a bigger point, I think, is often this debate around borders and migration feels very digital. People either are perceived to want either a wide open border or a totally closed border. And I, as a Christian, want to oppose that. The best metaphor I can think about for this is my household. So I like shutting the door and locking it at nighttime, like knowing everyone's safe home and no strangers are coming in without me knowing it. That's important to me. That's part of my responsibility as a father. But my door is not permanently closed. I'm a foster carer. So at any time in the night, the social worker might call me and suddenly more children are coming into my home. And I don't think I would be a good father if I accepted 1,000 children to come and live in my home. That would not be appropriate. I'd cease to be a family. So I recognize there are resource limits. But I still think I can be hospitable and kind. So I have 6 children that live in my home, 3 are birth children, 3 are fostered and adopted. I think if I got a call from social services, I'd want to make room because these children have got the most difficult circumstances. So I think in the same way you can have compassion and control, you can have planned migration, a fast and fair system, safe routes. We can work out as a country a realistic measurement of how many people can we actually receive. And it's probably higher than most people think. I mean, we were just hearing about Lebanon. 1.5 million refugees came to Lebanon from Syria, and they were incredibly generous. We're talking about a tiny fraction of that playing our part in the global economy.
But I think the point that that Paul might make and Sebastian is actually that the asylum question, vitally important though it is, tends to dwarf the other debates about migration that are taking place. Family reunification, student families, and so on. Yeah. And that it's that kind of skewing the debate.
It is skewing the debate. When you look at the numbers, you're looking at net migration. Asylum seekers were less than 5% of net migration, and yet they've had all the attention and all the money thrown at it through the Rwanda program. So 95% of migration isn't that. And again, there's a bigger question about what kind of levels of migration are appropriate. It shouldn't be just a number. We might want to be asking other questions in terms of, to be fair, what Ian raised, I am also mindful that we shouldn't be causing a brain drain from other countries into ours. That's not appropriate. But what is right? What is good for our country and good for the global scene? I think we can balance those two things. And to be honest, that's one of the things I think that's been lacking in a lot of the manifestos. There's not much of our role as a global player, as someone that has responsibility, as a big economy. We're not really talking a lot about that. We've become very, I suppose, parochial in our thinking, and we need to think of ourselves again as a global player. I believe in Great Britain, not Little Britain, and a lot of these manifestos have felt very small-minded.
Yeah, I just want to make the point there on the latest figures that asylum seekers come under 100,000 a year, probably about 90,000 a year last year. Work visas over 400,000, I think, and student visas are a little bit lower than that. So cumulatively, I'm just affirming that point there, that all our time is spent talking about, well, there's firstly a crisis framing. So this is constantly treated by really in political discourse, and to a certain extent by the two main political parties, as a problem that needs urgently to be addressed, while ignoring the fact that the majority of migration to the UK is legal migration, and it's visa migration as well. So these are people that the British government is saying, yes, you can come, live, work, study here. And that, yes, so that disjointed and unbalanced debate is a very real issue. That's my point, basically.
Sebastian, I mean, what would you like to say to the Conservatives or other parties about the sort of student visas, the work visas?
I'd like to see more refugees accepted into Britain, but I think the problem is that we're having this conversation, but it's a question of winning consent, because what we've seen is people have had high levels of migration imposed upon them, and they've had it imposed upon them by parties that consistently promise not to do it. And that creates a huge level of public mistrust and cynicism. And the people paying the price are increasingly the most vulnerable refugees. And I would want to see that pattern reversed. I think we should train more people domestically, bring legal migration vastly much under control. If we had like 1990s level of legal migration, we would be able to take on far more refugees than we do now. And I think people would be much more supportive of it. I think the problem is that when you look at the level of global need, and you look at the number of people we take in who aren't in distress, who aren't in desperate need, and we're putting them at the front of the queue instead of the back of it, and that becomes a massive problem if you want to bring in the number of refugees that would make a difference. If you've got net migration of 600,000 a year, there is a simple question of scope and resources, and refugees are going to be squeezed out time and time again.
Yeah, can I just come in again? I think I heard Sebastian use the word uncontrolled. I mean, the point about visa migration is it's controlled.
But not by the public. This is the difference. It's the government is, of course, in control, but it's promising to do it and then not doing it. So people.
So yes, I agree. They
government does, but
false expectations about the way that the levels that immigration can be reduced to a greater or lesser extent. I think parties are guilty of doing that.
I'm just going to ask a question, maybe to you, Sebastian. We haven't mentioned yet the boats. What is the best way of stopping the boats from coming over?
I'm sure we all hear from men on privileged people who think the solution is safe and legal routes. I'm not opposed to the idea of safe and legal routes, though some exist, not as many perhaps there should. I think the problem is that I don't think that you're going to. I think the main problem that we have is there is not sufficient sympathy and consent. And I think Chris made a really important point. One of the things that was transformative about the Ukrainian experience is that families and people were enthusiastic. There was popular support. Communities came together and helped people. Now, if you want to produce something like that, you have to create confidence that we can control our borders, confidence that crime will be policed equally and fairly, confidence that you're not just going to take groups of unaccompanied young men, dump them in the most deprived communities and then forbid them from working. It's a recipe for disaster, and it undermines the entire cause. So I think, Keir Starmer's promised to do something. I'm very encouraged that he's making a priority of the labour market. I'd like there to be more detail, but I think if we can get something done about small boats, if we can stop people coming in the first place, if we can get them back to France, not Rwanda, which is mad and immoral, then I think you can start building confidence for doing migration and for doing refugee policy in a different way.
Okay, I'm just going to put that same question to Chris, and then I'm going to come to everybody, all the panelists, and just sort of say, one thing you want people to bear in mind on this immigration issue when they go to the polls. So, Chris.
I do agree that you could smash the gangs. We have the ability to do it.
We do?
I do think it's possible. Yeah, I do. Like, even down to where the boats are coming from, the engines are coming from, there are easier ways to smash the gangs.
How? Why hasn't it been done if it's possible?
Because we've spent all the money on a deterrent that hasn't worked. So, it shocked me. I thought from a Conservative Party that often like to appear in a military context, they're getting a Chinook helicopter to go to Southampton, that being on a speedboat with machine gun wielding soldiers would actually be a good look. But I'm surprised we haven't put more effort. We are going to need to work more closely with the EU, because we can't solve this problem on our own. And that's been another issue because of the post-Brexit kind of conversation. So I think we need a joined up approach. We need to go after the gangs. I definitely think that is possible. I think we need a fast and fair asylum system when they get here, not one that says, I'm not even going to listen to your claim. Even if you claim you've been trafficked, I'm going to send you to Rwanda. That seems completely immoral. But a fast and fair system. And then, as we've seen with Albania, you can return people whose asylum claim has failed. They have actually succeeded in that. And that's through working very closely with the Albanian government. And some of that has been investment, as we've said, to build those anchors and not walls. So I think all of those things can actually make a difference.
Thank you. Liam, I'm just going to come to you, and then I'm going to ask you all for a final question before we sign off.
I think on the point around boats, we can't dismiss the real importance of providing safe routes, and there are vanishingly few safe routes for people to reach the UK at the moment. A few routes from a few specific countries, but for the vast majority of refugees who will have reasons for trying to reach the UK in a small number of cases because of family connections here, or because of speaking the language, or because it's the place where they're most likely to find safety. Actually providing safe routes is the way to do that, and throwing more money at border controls, we've seen time and time again, has led to more sophisticated trafficking and smuggling, because people in desperate need are always going to try to reach safety. Any of us would do that for our families.
Thank you so much. Now, Liam, I'll just stay with you. You happen upon somebody coming into the polling booth when you go in, and they say, "Oh gosh, I really don't know who to vote for." What would you say to them to bear in mind if they've got immigration on their mind? What would be your message to them?
I would say to look at the human behind this debate, to look at the people who we're talking about, particularly when we're talking about people seeking asylum, about refugees, and to think what any of us would do to find safety for our families, and to look at the approach that the UK is taking right now, where we're spending vast amounts of money locking people up in inhumane conditions in immigration detention, where we're spending vast amounts of money sending people to, attempting to send people to Rwanda, where we're shutting down the asylum system and people's right to claim sanctuary here, and that we're denying the humanity of people. And I would ask people to, put themselves in that position, to think about what our shared values are. We want to provide welcome and safety to people. We want to give people the right to work and to contribute to our society. And we want to treat everyone with dignity.
Thank you. Zara?
Yeah, I think this has been such an important discussion to have, because it really strikes home to our own inner compassion and sense of welcome, in that what is the kind of vision for the society that we actually have around us, and how do we want people to fit into that society? We know with climate change, conflict and wars raging, people are going to continue to be displaced and looking for safe places for sanctuary. We know that with the cost of living crisis, with our economics, there is going to be a real test to our resolve in terms of infrastructure, policy making, and also community building. I think all of us as good faith actors have a responsibility to do our bit to ensure the conversation is one that takes us to a better place. I think the future government really needs to consider this isn't just a single issue or one that can be conflated into many. Our universities and workforce need diverse skilled labour. Our communities benefit from being culturally diverse. And Britain in itself is part of a global range of actors that needs to continue to show good leadership in that resolve. So I think there's plenty to do, but hopefully scrapping the Rwanda scheme will be probably one of the first things I'd advocate for.
Thank you. Sebastian, briefly, if you would.
Yeah, no, I just actually wanted to, on this question, to actually a question to Liam on this question of safe and legal routes. Now, of course, we have some safe and legal routes, but they are basically geographically narrow. So there's a safe and legal route from Ukraine, there's a safe and legal route from Hong Kong. There is not a safe and legal route from every country which might need it in the world. Now, my question is, of course, the fact there are not safe and legal routes from many countries means people from those countries don't have the opportunity to come here. But at the same time, supposing we did have a universally available safe and legal route, it would still be heavily rationed, would it not? So I think Ian mentioned there are over 40 million refugees and displaced persons. Now, if we're not even in the most generous scheme being able to take more than a fraction of those people. So I suppose my question is, we'll have to narrow it somehow. And I worry there'll be a huge administrative burden if we create a scheme that anybody around the world can apply to. Whereas, in fact, isn't there an argument for saying that maybe there should be more, but by narrowing schemes like, for example, to Ukraine, we could be relatively unlimited in it. We could rely on goodwill. Isn't that geographical narrowing quite an efficient way of filtering it without creating burdens on the Home Office, which, as we know, huge backlogs, complete administrative chaos? I mean, I don't trust the Home Office to run the scheme like that.
I'm actually, Liam, I don't know if you want to answer in the chat box, because we are nearly at the hour, and I do just want to hear very briefly from Krish and from Paul. You're at the polling booth. I mean, what are you hoping people will have in their minds if they're considering immigration as they vote?
If they're a person of faith, and particularly if they're a Christian, I would call them back to the two greatest commandments: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbour. So as you assess the different claims of the parties, which party is going to help you to love your neighbour most effectively? And remember, your neighbour is anyone on the planet, anyone in your neighbourhood, anyone in our country.
Paul?
Resist false, simple answers and false, simple descriptions of what immigration is in the UK. Is complex. It needs to be disaggregated. Probably, I would discourage them voting on that basis at all. I think the wider economic, social vision is more important. Some of these things, in a sense, need to be depoliticized. Take the heat out of them, work out what we can do, how can we make things a little bit better. It will never be quote unquote fixed. Immigration is something that will be with us for a very long time to come. The question is, how do we manage it humanely and generously?
So maybe you can park the deeper conversation for later, because it's unlikely to happen in the next 2 weeks on this campaign, I guess. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for taking part today. There are going to be 2 more briefings next week. I think I'm right, Ruth, in thinking that one is going to be on the economy and one is going to be on climate. I do hope that you'll join us, and thank you so much, everybody, for your time today.